I mean, it's a very sad situation. One of my children and my partner live in Paris. It's a very difficult thing for me to be isolated from them in a situation like this. So I understand the European upset, but just like as was mentioned before, I've also been around long enough in understanding geopolitics and the interiors of these organizations to see that what happened in Paris has been happening almost every day in Syria, Iraq, and Libya for the past 5 years. So if we go back, there's sort of two ways of looking at this. One is WikiLeaks documents of the US Embassy, as far back as 2006, show that the US had a serious campaign to overthrow the government of Syria. Now that might not surprise some people that they're opposed to the government of Syria because Israel is sitting on Syrian land in the Golan Heights. Turkey has interests from the north. There's a Russian military base at Tartus, which a lot of old Cold Warriors like Brzezinski feel is unfinished business from the Cold War, the last Russian naval base. Can they finally get that? And you can see the Russian position in relation to Crimea and its naval base there, that it's willing to throw in a lot to preserve what it considers one of its last remaining strategic assets outside of Russia. But the details of that are, they're sickening. The US pushed not simply to get rid of the Assad regime, but to increase the paranoia of the Assad regime. That word is used directly, to make the Assad regime frightened that it was going to be subject to a coup. Its military could not be trusted. That paranoia was designed, it's explicitly stated, to cause the Assad government to, quote, overreact, unquote. And there's many other things like that, trying to prevent foreign investment in Syria to damage its economy, refusing to cooperate as late as 2010 with Syrian calls to help it crack down on terrorists crossing over the border between Syria and Iraq. So there's a litany of, in some ways, what you expect. US grand area geostrategy to try and destabilize Syria, being pulled in to perhaps in an interesting manner to the orbit of its regional allies, which have grown relatively stronger as time has gone by. There is not a dominant Pax Americana in the Middle East anymore. There is allies of the United States who are work very closely with it and with European countries like the United Kingdom, but they chafe at the leash that has been put on them and want to go their own way, and they also pull their master along with it. So that's what's happened in Syria. Of course, you also have a government that is a dictatorship with a fairly terrible record, but not for the region. For the region, one of the few remaining secular governments that the US has been knocking off one by one. Possibly because secularism was a quest of the left, which was supported by the Soviet Union. So these remaining secular governments are unfinished business to Cold War warriors. But I want to look a little bit at something else, which is a spiritual dimension to what is going on. I don't think everything can be explained just by geopolitics. And to illustrate that, I want to talk about Libya and what was Hillary's war. That's something that's not widely spoken about. It's very interesting that the Republicans have not taken this up. But Libya was Hillary's war. Hillary pushed hard for Libya. She also pushed hard to keep Hosni Mubarak. But she pushed hard for Libya over and above the recommendations made by Pentagon generals. Pentagon generals have subsequently come out through a variety of testimony and leaks saying we pushed against this. There was no proper plan for what happened in Libya. We didn't want another Iraq, which we're already having. And here is Hillary's response to the moment that she was told that Gaddafi was killed.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I sure did.
So, I mean, that is the land of unconfirmed visits.
Yes, we came, we saw, we died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I sure did.
So, I mean, that is the land
I'm
of
sorry about that.
Neither Slava could make a better joke, I think.
Yeah.
Neither him could imagine something more bizarre, I think. Or he could.
That is Hillary's response to a head of state being sodomized and killed. How does that affect the psychology of the population in terms of what is the new norm endorsed by the superpower that just helped overthrow this government? That is the new norm. That is something embedded within Hillary Clinton. That personality that you just saw, that personality is going to be in the White House 80% chance, if not more. The bookmakers have it at about 85% chance in a year's time. It's going to couple with what we have been seeing with ISIS. Now, if you've read Dubkick, which is ISIS's magazine, ISIS was clear at the time of the Charlie Hebdo attacks what its strategy is in the West. It's something that's evolved from a 2004 strategy document by one of Al-Qaeda's theoreticians. That older document is called The Management of Savagery. But it is to cause a crackdown in the West on Muslims in order to eliminate the grey zone. That's Al-Qaeda's phrase. To eliminate this grey zone of Muslims that cross over between being strict Muslims and pussyfooting with European notions of enlightenment or Christian notions. And that's working splendidly right now. It's exactly what is going to happen. You can see that with Hollande's statements. Hollande, rather than trying to preserve the robustness of the French population, the robustness of the French character in response to such an attack, he's telling people to go to hospitals. He's whipping up the sense of communal fear, closing borders, overreacting in such a way that is guaranteed to cause long-term crackdown on the Muslim population. Of course, it's also been used to introduce a whole raft of mass surveillance legislation, justify, of course, the British surveillance bill that's right before Parliament now. But I think we are in a very awful time. I do not see the interaction with Islam in Europe going anywhere good. I see extremism on both sides of the equation being generated by this interaction style. The basic underlying technological transformation, which has caused the breakdown in the borders between states, the communications breakdown, and therefore the organizational breakdown in the communications between states, is causing an interdigitization, an interperforation of what were national borders. And that seems like a dream in some respects. But in other respects, it means that the clashing intellectual and spiritual values of different groups start to interact with each other. There's no exit game. There's no exit strategy for ISIS that has been presented to it. There's no exit strategy for those radicalized Muslims. There is no alternative ideological dream for those people in Europe. There might have once been a communist or Marxist ideological dream that created although they were difficult dictatorships, nonetheless secular dictatorships from the Ba'ath Party, those dreams are gone. I don't see anything that can occupy the mental space for young people who long for that dream. That would be a great project of the European left, of a potential renewed European left. I still find it hard to imagine. I think what the only hope is something along the lines of a new Christianity. Not Christianity, but the same kind of reformist notion of swapping out hate for some aspects of love that you have in Christianity. Now, it's not going to be Christianity because Islam postdates Christianity. Islam is competitive with Christianity. Islam removed most of Christianity from the regions in the Middle East that it occupies. Not all of it, but most of it. There needs to be a reformed, if you like, a Christian version of Islam where the balance of costs and benefits in the struggle that is occurring there moves to a benefit in relation to cooperation. TTIP and the triangle it is part of a new global economic and legal partition of the world is, I think, the most ambitious concrete plan since the creation of the European Union, since possibly the creation of the WTO, although it goes much further. Okay, so you've got TTIP, TISA, and TTIP. These are respectively TPP, the US, Pacific, Australia binding together. TPP, US and EU. TISA, 52 countries, and it affects about 80% of the economy, has to do with services. This creates a new global enclosure where 2/3 of global GDP are inside the triangle, 1.6 billion people are inside the triangle, and the rest outside. What is outside? Essentially all the non-Western countries that are not allies in some way of the United States. So China, Russia, South Africa, India, in fact most of the world, nearly all of Africa, is outside this triangle. Now, how has that come to be? How has such a titanic reordering of the world's legal and economic system come to be? Whenever you have something really big happen, you know that there are multiple forces coming to be. Just like when Johannes was speaking about the construction of the European Union. You had very big forces of coal and steel coming together. You also had something else. You had the Cold War and the geostrategic reason for integrating the European Union. And then you had appeal to liberal Enlightenment values. With this, you have large multinationals who have always wanted to get special deals to increase their monopoly power in medicines, for example, or in relation to copyrights. They've wanted to increase those powers, always, and they're always pushing and lobbying for it. But finally, they were able to play the China card strategically. And that got the security and strategic forces involved in the United States and in Europe and in Southeast Asia onto the same page. And so it's happening. Now, Hillary Clinton calls TTIP 2 years ago an economic NATO, appealing to that strategic vision of merging together the United States and Europe, sucking Europe away from the Eurasian integration that is happening to the east. The Defense Secretary Ashton Carter earlier this year called TPP as important for the rebalancing to Asia. By that they mean what was previously called the Asia pivot, which is a euphemism for encirclement of China. More important for the rebalancing to Asia than another aircraft carrier. Put explicitly in these heavy geopolitical terms, in order not simply to educate people within the security sector. He wasn't simply speaking at some think tank trying to discuss how we're going to do it, but rather to get backing for it passing through Congress, which it successfully has done. So that, I think, I have different views about how the world comes to be, how different things come to be. I often think that strategists and people who portend themselves to be leaders are always looking what's going to happen and leap in front of the train and say, that way, go on train that way, as if they're beckoning it forward. But actually they're playing a certain game where things are moving in a particular direction anyway, and they want to establish their leadership credentials by just being there in front. But here we have a unique situation where there's not so much an organic mass just going off in its own direction. For example, with the change in prices of basic commodities. Rather, we have a very organized, detailed plan, which we have released. Nearly all of ties are now very many chapters of TTIP, and tonight we're actually releasing all of TPP into a searchable form. That organized plan is, in some ways, seems to be a vestige of something older and more classical, which was these, giant geostrategic theories with detailed plans that bind different countries together in different ways. But as it's the largest one, and it will change, it will permanently lock in a more radical form of neoliberalism into Europe, into Southeast Asia, into the United States. I think it really must be engaged in a similar way to which it was constructed. It must be intellectually engaged with and not just left to the vagaries of the weather and how market prices change and how people move. Yeah, well, it's a little hard to respond to Yanis because we agree on so much. Okay, I'll try and move past it. Well, I like being an intellectual pessimist, and I agree at the end you just simply have to proceed anyway. But I think it's necessary to be an intellectual pessimist to cut through. Actually, I would even say that somehow the analytical part of the mind is better engaged in response to a mood of pessimism. It might be a mood of pessimism touched with anger, but I think nonetheless intellectually people are better engaged at trying to really understand something. And then once you really understand it, then you then you become, you develop a sort of constructive instinct, which is about building things. Okay. I spent a lot of time understanding Silicon Valley because I was involved in the embryonic internet. I've been hacking Pentagon General's emails since I was 17, and I've met a lot of these big players like Eric Schmidt. Quite frightening, the chairman of Google. Quite frightening the worldview of people like that. I think as individuals, probably emotionally fine, but the intellectual worldview and the poverty in that worldview, but it is something that has circulated around Silicon Valley, and it is now the most aggressive ideology on earth. This is high-tech liberalism. And high-tech liberalism is dominating the competition for ideas. I wouldn't even say there's any competition at all, frankly. There's maybe some frontiers of Islam are now engaged in a rapid ideological development. And over here we have high-tech liberalism. And I don't see actually anything significant in terms of scale happening between the two. So high-tech liberalism is this philosophy of Silicon Valley that has merged with capitalism, and it is all about where the future is proceeding. Now, Google produced a book, The New Digital Age, about 2 years ago, that explicitly tried to claim that intellectual leadership, not just in relation to economics, but in relation to geopolitics. That Google would be Washington's geopolitical visionary, and the geopolitics of the world are now being coupled, at least in the United States, at this vision of Silicon Valley. The vision of Silicon Valley, basically put, is that Silicon Valley companies can manage everything better through their scale and competency. And they are replacing various elements of even local government now, these Silicon Valley companies. And when I hear back from people in India or China, smart young people, and you ask, what do you want to do with your life? And their answer is, well, if they're an average person, they want to go work for Facebook. If they're a bit more radical, then they want to start their own Facebook. But in both countries, India and China, the surrounding ideological context is an adoption of Silicon Valley. There's no we're going to do it the Chinese way. And what they mean by doing it the Chinese way is simply doing it in China and having it staffed by Chinamen. That's the Chinese way. There is no ideological alternative to what's going on. And it's that new ideology is progressing at such a rapid rate that I think if there's not decent alternatives put on the table, both about how Silicon Valley came to be as a critique to the false myth that Silicon Valley has been putting out, and ideological alternatives about where we're going, then we simply completely abandon the ideological domain to this high-tech neoliberalism. And Islam, which is the other, radical Islam, is the only other expanding ideology.